Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the richest and most powerful women in medieval Europe. She personally put 3 of her sons on the throne of England, and when she died, she made one final power play, so vicious, it went down in history. Eleanor became the heir when she was just 5 years old, but it only happened because of a tragic reason. The royal had 2 siblings, a younger sister named Petronilla, and a younger brother named William. Of course, because William was a boy, he should have been the heir to the kingdom of Aquitaine, but all that changed when William died. He was only 4 years old when he passed. The day that Eleanor became next in line to the throne should have been the best day of her life, but the exact opposite was true. When William perished of tuberculosis, he wasn't the only member of the family to fall victim to the disease. Eleanor also lost her mother. At just 5 years old, the future queen had already lost half of her immediate family. When Eleanor came into her inheritance, she became the first and only woman to rule her own duchy. That alone would be enough of an achievement for most people, but Eleanor wasn't satisfied. She'd go on to live a life that ran from inspirational and groundbreaking to heart-trending and utterly tragic. Once she became her father's heir, Eleanor received an education befitting a future queen. The best teachers in the land tutored the young girl in science, history, literature, philosophy, and languages. She also mastered horseback riding, was an excellent conversationalist, and could play games such as chess, checkers, and backgammon. With skills like these, it's no wonder that all the noblemen pounced at the chance to wed Eleanor. With her father's death in 1137, Eleanor instantly entered the bewildering life of a bona fide world leader. The little girl became the Duchess of Aquitaine, and was quickly placed under the protection of the King of France, aka Louis the Fat. The king wasted no time in pledging young Eleanor to be the bride of his son, Louis. The king sent his son, along with 500 men, to propose to 13-year-old Eleanor and to bring her back to the French palace. The King of France didn't take Eleanor in out of the goodness of his heart. Eleanor's territory, the Duchy of Aquitaine, was the wealthiest and largest province in the country, even larger than that of the king. By marrying Eleanor off to his son, the king would get his hands on her lands, and all without having to go to war. Eleanor wed the heir to the French throne, 17-year-old Louis, a mere 3 months after her father died. On August 8, 1137, Eleanor and young Louis officially became the rulers of France. Now, King Louis was never meant to be king. His spirited older brother died in a freak accident when he was still a teenager, and at the time, the royal family was grooming little Louis for a life in the church. The poor boy had literally been raised by monks. He was meek, unassuming, and awkward. When it came time for him to step up to the throne, he was woefully unprepared. But worse problems lay ahead. When Louis and Eleanor were supposed to get busy and produce an heir, they had the worst time possible. Historical records suggest that Louis wasn't a frisky man, and because of his reluctance to do the deed, the couple didn't have any children 7 years into their marriage. Even so, the people of France blamed the absence of an heir on one person, and one person alone, Eleanor. As though her forced marriage wasn't bad enough, when Eleanor arrived at the French court, she had even more problems. Louis's subjects detested the prince's new bride, and Eleanor hated life at the French palace. Eleanor was a strong-willed woman, and she didn't always get along with all her husband's friends. She clashed viciously with the eunuch courtier, Thierry de Galerin, using her razor-sharp wit to humiliate and mock him whenever possible. Furious, Thierry used his close friendship with Louis to try to turn the king against his bride. The medieval French court was full of this kind of intrigue, but things would get much more vicious. In 1142, Louis made the biggest mistake of his reign, and unfortunately for Eleanor, it had everything to do with her. Eleanor's younger sister arrived at the French court, and quickly fell for the brave veteran Raoul I. There was just one little problem. Raoul was already married. Louis unwisely interfered with Raoul's marriage, and decreed that he could renounce his wife and marry Eleanor's sister instead. He didn't know at the time, but this decision would destroy hundreds of lives. Unfortunately for Louis, Raoul's ex-wife was no slouch. Instead, the scorned woman was the niece of the powerful nobleman, Count Theobald II, and he was ticked that Louis let Raoul leave his bride. As payback for the king's actions, Count Theobald joined forces with Pope Innocent II, and once again, church and state were at war. Pope Innocent II didn't just defeat King Louis's forces, he took the king to school. The Pope infamously described Louis not as a formidable world leader, but, quote, a boy in need of instruction, quote. Then he excommunicated both Louis and Raoul for their role in the dissolution of Raoul's marriage. It was the PR disaster of the medieval period, and it was just getting started. In a highly unusual act for both queen and a woman, Eleanor insisted on accompanying her husband on the 1145 crusade. Unfortunately for Eleanor and Louis, the crusade was a complete failure. Despite all the pomp and fanfare at their departure, Louis's armies were massacred by Turkish forces. In a humiliating defeat, Louis abandoned his men and fled to Antioch. This was King Louis's first major battle, and it was a complete disaster. When it came time for the French people to explain the disaster of the crusade, they didn't blame Louis's ineffective leadership. Instead, they pointed their fingers at Eleanor. They said that Eleanor had encouraged other women to come along and distract their husbands on the crusade. If they hadn't been there, the Holy War would have succeeded. Once again, everything was Eleanor's fault. During Louis's doomed crusade, a dark rumor claimed Eleanor was having an affair with an extremely inappropriate person, her own uncle Raymond, the handsome prince of Antioch. To add fuel to the fire, when it was time for Eleanor and Louis to move from Antioch to Jerusalem, Eleanor stunned the court by refusing to accompany the king. Instead, she wanted to stay with her uncle Raymond, and possibly her lover. By this point, Louis was exhausted by the brutality of his crusade. Not only was Edessa, the territory he'd originally gone on the voyage to save, now abandoned. He'd lost hundreds of men, and now his wife was spending far too much time giggling with her handsome uncle. At a certain point, Louis reached his breaking point. Instead of letting Eleanor stay in Antioch, he forced her to continue to Jerusalem, where he could keep an eye on his bride. As Louis tried to drag Eleanor off to Jerusalem, she said something that would change European history forever. The furious queen spat that she and her husband shouldn't travel together as a man and wife because they were related in the 4th and 5th degrees. In medieval speak, this was a bombshell. Technically, royals couldn't wed if they weren't separated by 7 generations. Louis and Eleanor, meanwhile, were only separated by 4 or 5. Now, after 15 unhappy years with Louis, Eleanor finally had enough. She would try to end their marriage. When Louis and Eleanor got to Jerusalem in 1149, they sought audience with the Pope and asked him to grant them an annulment. On paper, it was because they were too closely related, but in reality, all the royal couples had intertwined families. In actuality, Louis and Eleanor had been married for 15 long years, and they still didn't have a male heir. Plus, on a more basic level, Eleanor simply didn't love Louis anymore. To her devastation, the Pope refused to annul the marriage. Soon, all of Europe was buzzing with the couple's scandalous attempt to split. After the Pope refused to grant Louis and Eleanor an annulment, he decided to play matchmaker and get these crazy kids back together. He hosted the unhappy couple at his residences and showed Louis and Eleanor to a luxurious room covered in silks. As they looked in, they saw one crucial detail. The room was furnished with just one bed. The message was clear. Do your royal duty and get busy. Meanwhile, Louis's big second crusade was dead in the water. The army originally planned to march to Damascus, but the journey had been such a failure that they cut their losses and headed back home. As though things couldn't get worse, Eleanor and Louis's ships were attacked on their way back to France, with the royal couple being separated by enemy forces and a vicious storm. When they next showed up in Rome together, the Pope once again played matchmaker, and 9 months later, the royal couple had a newborn daughter. The king was disappointed. After all, he needed a male heir. But Eleanor was already hatching a diabolical plan to get out of her marriage. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a master manipulator. Eleanor knew that if she'd given birth to a boy, she'd never be able to dump Louis. So for her, having little baby Alice was a blessing in disguise. The queen used this to her advantage, continuing to treat Louis coldly and making it clear that their marriage would only bring them both misery. Over time, the queen's cold treatment routine took effect. After years of resisting an annulment, Louis and the Pope suddenly changed their mind, and granted one to the royal couple. Louis was heartbroken, but Eleanor was delighted. There was one enormous catch to her split, and it weighed heavily on Eleanor's heart. Once she abandoned Louis, she also had to give up claims to her children, including little Alice, who wasn't even 2 years old at the time. They ended up going through with a split, and with this, Aquitaine retained its independence, and this land and title reverted back to Eleanor. A wealthy woman with land was a hot catch in Eleanor's time, so you'd expect she'd have no problem once she went back to the dating scene. Unfortunately, that's wrong. Eleanor was desirable, but to all the worst men, the greedy fortune hunters, and the violent social climbers. While she was on her way home after dumping Louis, not one, but two men tried to kidnap her. They planned to force her into marriage so they could take her land. Eleanor knew what kind of world she lived in. As long as she was single, sinister men would keep trying to abduct her and steal her money. She needed to act fast. A near 2 months after her annulment, Eleanor asked Henry, the future King of England, to marry her for protection. It was an offer he couldn't refuse, even though their union sent Europe a titter for 2 dark reasons. Europe's jaw dropped when they heard that Eleanor wed Henry. At 28 years old, Eleanor was a whopping 11 years older than her 19-year-old husband. But not only that, Henry was the brother of one of men who tried to kidnap Eleanor and force her into marriage. Now Eleanor's second husband Henry was everything Louis wasn't. Brave, energetic, ambitious, and supposedly hot-tempered. He and Eleanor were a strong couple, and by 1154, they were the king and queen of England. Even better, the duo clearly had bedroom chemistry. Eleanor gave birth to 8 children, and for all the stress over her inability to have a boy with Louis, she and Henry had 5 sons. It looked like Eleanor and Henry were the perfect match, but things wouldn't stay rosy forever. When Eleanor's ex, King Louis, learned that she married Henry, he was pretty ticked. Not only had she married without his consent, which she needed, but the combination of Henry and Eleanor's land meant that Henry, who was actually King Louis's subordinate, now had control over half of France. In other words, Eleanor had managed to dump the King of France and somehow be more powerful than him. Some of Louis's anger might have come from jealousy, but he had one legitimate reason to be upset with Eleanor. She'd left him by claiming they were too closely related, then gone and married Henry II, who was an even closer relative. The angry French king did what any royal would do, declare war on his ex and her new husband. Going into battle didn't work out so well for Louis, who had an awful track record with military strategy. He suffered an embarrassing defeat at Henry's capable hands. Now, with 5 sons, it seemed like Eleanor's political legacy was guaranteed, but by 1189, the family had endured so many tragedies that only a few of the boys remained. The couple's firstborn, William, died when he was just 3 years old. Years later, in a freak accident, their son Geoffrey was trampled to death during a jousting tournament in Paris. But the most startling death belonged to the couple's heir, Henry the Younger. Henry Jr. and his father didn't have the greatest relationship. Henry II loved power and resisted giving his heir even minor land and responsibilities. Over the years, Henry the Younger grew resentful. When dear old dad decided to give some of Henry Jr.'s castle to his little brother John, Henry lost it. He was 18 years old, ready to rule, and stymied by his controlling dad. And little Henry wasn't the only one that had issues with the king. Eleanor and Henry's other sons, Richard and Geoffrey, weren't too happy with their father either. The boys teamed up and hatched a daring plan. They would revolt against their dad, overthrow him, and seize the throne. One night, while little Henry and his father were doing business, the heir snuck out of the fortress and abandoned his dad, instead running off to another court. Henry the Younger had married a French princess whose dad just so happened to be King Louis, Eleanor's ex. After Eleanor dumped him, he shacked up with a new bride and had even more daughters, one who married Eleanor's son with her own second spouse, King Henry II. So not only had young Henry abandoned his father, he defected to an enemy's court, and the bad news would keep coming. Between 1173 and 1174, 2 people joined forces with young Henry and King Louis. In a shocking twist, they were none other than the king's sons, Richard and Geoffrey. Together, the boys plotted to overthrow their father and seize the throne. And what was Eleanor doing while the men in her family turned on each other? Let's just say she supported her children's rebellious phase. By pledging allegiance to her kids, Eleanor took the top spot on her husband's personal enemies list. But the marriage hadn't been going great before that anyway. In 1167, the couple began to grow apart. So by 1173, their once fiery passion had turned ice cold. Because of this, when Henry heard that his 13- and 14-year-old sons, Richard and Geoffrey, had suddenly teamed up with his rebellious heir, he knew exactly who was behind the defection. Eleanor hadn't just tagged along with her son's revolt, she'd manufactured it herself. Henry was furious, and he wouldn't rest before he got his revenge. Now to this day, historians aren't sure why Eleanor turned on her husband. Henry II was obsessed with keeping power to himself, even if he promised territories and responsibilities to the people around him. Just as Henry's selfishness had infuriated his heir, it festered resentment in his wife. When Henry gave up Eleanor's claim to the land of Toulouse, she had enough. She took power into her own hands and plotted against her husband. Before Eleanor betrayed Henry, no European queen had ever waged war on her own husband. Eleanor began to gather her forces, working alongside her ex-husband King Louis and the three sons to mount a formidable defense against King Henry II. There was just one more thing left to do. She had to get to Paris to join the French court and command her troops. She disguised herself in men's clothing and began the perilous journey. She didn't know it at the time, but the trip would be her downfall. As Eleanor snuck through France en route to Paris, she was shocked to find herself suddenly surrounded. Henry's forces had tracked her down. With the queen in their clutches, they had no mercy. They took Eleanor captive, without publicly announcing her arrest, and imprisoned her in various castles and fortresses for 16 long years. Now by 1889, Henry was almost 60 years old, and the years of endless conflict weighed on him heavily. He eventually passed, with his two remaining sons united against him. With the death of King Henry, his son Richard finally got the power he had craved for so long. After Eleanor made a victory tour through England with her son Richard, she pulled off one more triumph, making her troublemaker son John reconcile with his older brother. As the boys embraced after so many years of fighting, Eleanor felt at peace. On March 31, 1204, the indomitable queen breathed her last breath, but before she exited the earth, she had made arrangements for one final gotcha. Eleanor is buried next to her husband, Henry II, and her son Richard the Lionheart. Given everything Henry subjected Eleanor to, you'd think she wouldn't want to spend eternity next to him, and you'd be right. That's why even in death she managed to get in one last dig at her tool of a husband. Eleanor had her tomb built a few inches higher than her husband's, elevating her above him for all of time. Thanks for watching Tales That Tell. If you love uncovering the best stories in true history of all things famous and uncovered, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us.